Shall we go ahead and get started, maybe? All right. So welcome to the Institute of Philosophy's Personal Practical and Political Practical and the Ethical seminar series. Thank you all for coming. So the talk today will be recorded. The question and answer won't, but not that you would, but please don't interrupt the talk. And today I am very pleased to introduce Samantha Weiss from University of Witwatersrand, who will be talking to us today about vision and ethics looking at animals.
Thank you very much, Kate, and thanks also to Richard and Jonathan for setting this up and for the invitation. It's really nice to be able to speak to people on the other side of the world like this, and it's good to have this opportunity, so thank you. As you saw from the abstract, my interest is in vision and in ethics and in animals, and I'm trying to hold a whole lot of different moving parts together, so this is a first attempt at it, really. So, the language of vision recurs throughout the history of Western philosophy, and it is central to our ethical thoughts and practices. We say, for instance, we were blinded by jealousy, but then our vision cleared. We have blind spots, we see red, we are morally myopic or clear-sighted, and we have or lack insight. If we're lucky, the truth is illuminated to us and our eyes are opened. Even those who are suspicious of sensory perception and the world of appearances, like Plato, allow for a competing kind of intellectual perception. But alongside the Platonic suspicion of sensory perception, there's another philosophical tradition mostly identified with Aristotle, and they've understood some central meta-ethical and epistemological issues in perceptual terms. For instance, some have suggested that we can understand moral properties or moral knowledge in perceptual terms, and I'm thinking here of John McDowell, Robert Audi, Jonathan Dancy. We can see that an action is cruel, or we can see a cruel action or see an action as cruel. And this perception, it is thought, can be the source of knowledge. Like other forms of perception, moral perception is not inferential. We do not infer the cruelty of the action from perceiving its non-normative properties, but we just see a cruel action. And like other kinds of visual experience, moral perception on this account has a what it is likeness to it. So seeing a cruel action will be phenomenally different from seeing a neutral action or a kind action. Similarly, certain theories of emotions understand emotion as a kind of perception or as analogous to perception. And if you think that emotions can give us access to evaluative facts, then emotions can provide some evaluative knowledge through perception. This is Julian Diana, I'm quoting here, says emotions could perhaps track how the world is evaluative for one, in a sense similar to the way perceptions track how the world is perception for one. Now, these debates use the language of visual, it seems more or less literally, or as a very close analogy. But the philosophers who most interest me here appear to use this language more metaphorically, and they have broader ethical concerns. For instance, they argue that being a virtuous person and living a moral life requires appropriate perception of the world and ourselves. And this is usually put in visual terms. We're familiar with this again from Aristotle, who Ross later quotes as saying the decision rests with perception. Martha Nussbaum describes and then takes up the Aristotelian position, and she writes, practical insight is like perceiving in the sense that it is non-inferential, non-deductive. It is an ability to recognize the salient features of a complex situation. And Lawrence Blum argues that moral philosophy's focus on general principles has concealed the essential role that moral perception plays. I'm just going to read a passage from Blum here. He says, an agent may reason well in moral situations, uphold the strictest standards of impartiality for testing her maxims and moral principles, and be adept at deliberation. Yet, unless she perceives moral situations as moral situations, and unless she perceives their moral character accurately, Her moral principles and skills at deliberation will be for naught, and may even lead her astray. In fact, one of the most important moral differences between people is between those who miss and those who see various moral features of situations confronting them. Now, besides Aristotle, people like Blum and Nussbaum are influenced most famously by Iris Murdoch, whose work is permeated by visual language. Her emphasis is on self-perfection, so that a person's vision and quality of consciousness is thereby perfected. According to Murdoch, our vision is clouded by different factors: personal, cultural, relational, ideological. And the task of a moral life is to purify our vision so that we can see the world, in particular other people. She writes that the characteristic and proper mark of the active moral agent is a just and loving gaze directed upon an individual reality. And we ought to work on realizing, again I'm quoting, a refined and honest perception of what is really the case, a patient and just discernment and exploration of what confronts one, which is the result not simply of opening one's eyes, but of a certain perfectly familiar kind of moral discipline. The problem with Murdoch is that she is so quotable, it's hard to stop quoting her, so I'll give you a few more. What she does is contrast the state of the self really with the moral task and the ideal that we should be approaching. And she contrasts the dangerous fascination of looking inwards at the dazzling but distorting self with the work of attention to the world beyond ourselves. She says the self, the place where we live, is a place of illusion. Goodness is connected with the attempt to see the unself, to see and to respond to the real world in the light of a virtuous consciousness. Moral change is slow because we are not free in the sense of being able suddenly to alter ourselves, since we cannot suddenly alter what it is we see. We can practice virtue, she thinks, by attending closely to nature, to art, or to intellectual activities, and most importantly, to other people. In one of her examples of a person trying to ethically improve, she writes, "Is not the metaphor of vision almost irresistibly suggested? And is it not the natural metaphor? The mother-in-law looks at the daughter-in-law. She attends to her, she focuses her attention." And she speaks of the mother in this example of saying to herself, "Let me look again." So visual language is all over in Murdoch. And the kind of exploration that Blum, Nussbaum, and Murdoch are interested in is also my concern here, what we could roughly call the ethics of vision. Now, I think that their use of visual concepts is mostly metaphorical, but though this isn't always quite clear in Blum's case. But the interesting thing is that they use them as live rather than dead metaphors, and they take the visual language seriously, even if non-literally. They think it reveals a dimension of ethics that would otherwise be occluded. And of course, there are metaphors that we live by, and we should take them seriously as metaphors to see how they construct the world that we live in. But I want to explore the possibility that they are more than metaphors, and that they also have potency when understood literally. So roughly, if we're asking the question of whether vision can have ethical import, put very generally, what exactly is it we're asking? And I understand that question to incorporate two other questions. These aren't exhaustive, there'll be others. The first question is, can one literally look in better and worse ways, i.e. better and worse aesthetically, simply as perception? And the second question is, can our aesthetically better or worse vision also be in some intrinsic way better or worse ethically? Now, answering the first question, whether one can literally look in better or worse ways, is necessary in order to take vision seriously and non-metaphorically. And answering two, whether that kind of better aesthetic vision can be better ethically is needed in order for vision and the visual language of philosophers to be doing real ethical work. That is, we are wanting some non-accidental relation between literal looking and ethical results. And if we can sensibly answer yes to these questions, we have a reason to claim that insofar as vision is better or worse aesthetically, it will be better or worse ethically. Now, I'm not going to argue that there's a necessary condition between good vision and ethics. I'm just content to present considerations to show that there is an intrinsic and non-accidental relation that would hold generally. Now, this is obviously an enormous area. And as I said, I'm already holding a lot of different parts together. So I'm going to narrow my focus even more and look at animals. And I'm doing this for two reasons. The first is aesthetic. While there is a growing body of literature in environmental aesthetics, there's still not much on the aesthetics of animals in particular, even though their beauty is all around us and is so important to us. If animals are spoken about in this literature, it's often just as other objects in the natural environment. They're not singled out for special treatment. The second reason is ethical. No one except the most churlish would deny that many animals are beautiful. And my hope is that taking our aesthetic appreciation seriously might provide an alternative, less traveled road to treating them better. So perhaps appreciation of their beauty can do what straightforward ethical arguments have not always been able to accomplish. Okay, before I get into this substantially, I just want to say a few things about my terms and give a couple of stipulations here. Firstly, about the term aesthetics. By aesthetic appreciation or experience or pleasure, I mean minimally an appreciation or satisfying experience of how an object is manifested to our senses. And this pleasure is taken in the object for its own sake rather than because the object fulfills a need of ours. Once an object fulfills a need and we're interested in it for those reasons, our appreciation of it is no longer aesthetic, it's practical in some sense. And aesthetic properties are those properties that give rise to these experiences and which we would use in characterizing the experience. For example, we'll say that the gazelle is graceful, the cheetah is streamlined and elegant, and so on. The aesthetic properties are going to be partly dependent on sensory properties. Now, beauty is our preeminent aesthetic property, even though it is not the only one. And I am the authors that I'm going to draw on tend to concentrate on beauty. And as I've said, I'm going to be concentrating on visual beauty. And I say that admitting, of course, that vision is not the dominant sense for many people, even though it's been given a dominant place in philosophy. And I appreciate that my focus leaves out dimensions of perception as potentially powerful as vision. And it also leaves out the crucial ways that our senses build on and complement each other. I found I have an example of that just in these COVID days, because it feels like I can't really hear what people are saying through their mask, even though they're not mumbling and the sound is quite fine. It's like because I can't see their mouths and I can't quite locate the sound, I can't actually hear it properly as well. At least that's what it seems to me. So, final point about aesthetics. When I say that the experience of beauty depends on an object's presentation to the senses, I do not mean that aesthetic properties are necessarily immediately and obviously present to our perception. It can take work to discern beauty. So I think although beauty is in the first instance perceptual, it can take further work and attention to draw out all of the nuances of that perceptual experience. Okay, so let me begin with the first question then. Can we literally look in better or worse ways? And I'm going to think about this to start with by looking at some of the psychology of vision. Now, vision is never just looking. The cognitive and social sciences agree with the moral philosophers I've named that perception is not transparent, complete, or neutral. Vision is never innocent, and it is not simply the result of the physical workings of the eye. Donald Hoffman argues that vision is not merely a matter of passive perception, it is an intelligent process of active construction. And he concludes that to construct is the essence of vision. Dispense with construction and you dispense with vision. This is, he says, more than a brute fact, it is a dictate of logic. And Rudolf Arnheim writes in his influential study, Art and Visual Perception, that far from being a mechanical recording of sensory elements, vision is a truly creative apprehension of reality. The qualities that dignify the thinker and the artist distinguish all performances of the mind. The same principles apply to all the various mental capacities because the mind always functions as a whole. All perceiving is also thinking, all reasoning is also intuition, and all observation is also invention. Hoffman, Arnheim, and others explore the logical rules that structure how and what we see. And very simple, very basic instances include the construction of depth, construction of perspective and relative size, the inference to whole shapes from partial forms, the interpretation of overlapping objects, so which one is closer than another one, for instance, and the construction of boundaries. It seems that all human beings share these rules and construct the world according to similar logical structures, which Hoffman understands analogously to Chomsky's rules of universal grammar, calling them the rules of visual processing. Some of the mind's work in perception is demonstrated famously and familiar to most of us by visual illusions and paradoxes. And just to remind you, I'll show you a couple of pictures here. You all know the Muller-Lyer illusion, of course. The lines look different lengths, so they're actually the same. This is familiar. A similar kind of illusion makes us think that the one circle is bigger than the others because of the surrounding objects and its place in the bigger structure, when in fact it's the same size. And we're very good at constructing boundaries when things aren't actually given to us. So in experimental contexts or logic puzzles, these are fairly familiar to us. Much of the work on this psychology of vision is informed by Gestalt theory, which emphasizes that our perception of elements depends on their placement and function in an overall pattern. Arnheim says again that vision is not mechanical recording of elements, but rather the apprehension of significant structural patterns. And underlying all of this, of course, are the neural processes, which the relatively new field of neuroaesthetics is exploring in relation to artistic experiences in particular. Now, perception is, however, not structured only by shared subintentional processes and rules. And this is going to be important to what I'm doing here. The impersonal universal rules of perception and the configuration of neural networks meet up with the specific individual constraints of personality, history, particular knowledge and culture. And as some anthropological studies have shown in a very fascinating way, it seems that a person's metaphysical views also inform what it is they actually see. So all these factors taken together will construct the world that each one of us sees. For instance, schemata are cognitive structures that assist us in organizing and interpreting information, and they arise from prior encounters with the environment. But William James noted already in the 1890s how important individual differences are to perception and memory and to the activation of particular schemata. So walking down the same street, my interest in architecture will activate different schemata from another person who's more interested in cars or trees or dogs. different things will stand out to us as salient and noticeable. Now, Robert Salso and James Elkins have explored the individual psychological and normative dimensions of a particular person's particular acts of seeing. And here is Elkins, I'm quoting. No matter how hard I try, there will be things I do not see. No seeing sees everything, and no skill or practice can alter that. Every field of vision is clotted with sexuality, desire, convention, anxiety, and boredom, and nothing is available for full leisurely inspection. Seeing is also inconstant seeing, partial seeing, poor seeing, and not seeing, or to put it as strongly as possible, seeing involves and entails blindness. Seeing is also blindness. Now, Elkins puts this point quite rhetorically strongly, and I probably wouldn't take it quite as strongly as he does here, but he seems to be making 2 points. Firstly, that physiologically and neurologically, it's practically impossible to see everything in our visual field. And psychologically, the world is hidden or altered by our own peculiarities. And this, of course, is Murdoch's point, though she would have understood it metaphorically. Here she is again. She writes, by opening our eyes, we do not necessarily see what confronts us. We are anxiety-ridden animals. Our minds are continually active, fabricating an anxious, usually self-preoccupied, often falsifying veil which partially conceals the world. Our states of consciousness differ in quality. Our fantasies and reveries are not trivial and unimportant. So it's quite nice here to see Iris Murdoch writing in the 50s and 60s, being given some evidence by psychology. So there are numerous ways to see, and while all vision is constructed, it's plausible that against a specified background of concerns, instances of looking can be evaluated as more or less appropriate to those concerns. And we're familiar with this idea outside the realm of ethics. An artist or a critic will be aesthetically sensitive to dimensions of music or dance that the rest of us might miss. Medical specialists have to be taught to discern relevant features in often obscure x-rays or scans. And in fact, I've met an artist recently who is giving courses to doctors on how to interpret visual images. Animal breeders learn to evaluate a good specimen from a weaker one, largely on visual cues. Some people have an eye for design or fashion. And similarly, when our concerns are ethical, it doesn't seem implausible that we can evaluate our seeing as well against that backdrop. Now, one criterion for appropriate seeing is that it be constrained by what it is we are looking at, even as we admit the constructed nature of perception. Arnheim says this: the situations we face have their own characteristics, which demand that we perceive them appropriately. Looking at the world proves to require an interplay between properties supplied by the object and the nature of the observing subject. This objective element in experience justifies attempts to distinguish between adequate and inadequate conceptions of reality. If we focus on the aesthetic properties supplied by the object, the constraint on aesthetic appreciation of an object is that appropriate aesthetic appreciation reveals what aesthetic qualities and values the object has. And this is Alan Carlson's formulation. So bearing in mind this constraint, how would all of this work when the reality that we're looking at and interrelating to is non-human reality, particularly animals in the wild? So how then do we look at animals, and what is it that we see? And I'm going to start with some very minimal observations here. Quoting from Elkins again, he says, to human eyes, herds of animals and flocks of birds, not to mention schools of fish and clusters of bacteria, are just faceless mobs. It takes a biologist to sit down with a group of mountain gorillas to begin to see them as individuals. Now, I think this is definitely overstated. We non-specialists can pick out individual animals from groups, even from distances. And you just got to go to a park with a dog owner and see how they manage to keep track of their dog in a park that's heaving with other dogs. Often might look exactly the same. Farmers individuate their cattle, ranchers, their horses, and hunters individuate the particular animals of which they take aim. But that said, in these cases, we already have an interest in what we are seeing, and we have some kind of even minimal relationship with those animals. But apart from our pets and perhaps some farm animals, most people will only see animals at a distance and without building up any kind of relationship. So we'll see them on screens through lenses, separated from us by fences or by glass, or distant, the expanses of the veldt. And then what we usually see is a body partially occluded by the vegetation that camouflages it, or by other bodies. And from this we infer a whole animal. But bodies at a distance, and this means any bodies at a distance, are difficult to differentiate. Unless we are interested in subtle movements and reactions, one impala is much like another, as Elkin says. We will probably activate very general schemata to organize and interpret what we are seeing. So we'll spot something and generate the schema antelope and harmless, or lion, therefore dangerous. And this will also not aid individualization, unless again perhaps there's definite movement, which our eyes are very good at detecting. This way of looking that I've just described complements one of the few developed theoretical approaches that we do find to the aesthetics of animals, and it's a functionalist approach. I'm going to concentrate on this account in what follows. So according to functionalism about animals, the beauty of an animal is determined by its fitness for function. Glenn Parsons writes that an animal is beautiful when its form appears suited to or displays visible fitness for its function. And similarly, Ned Hettinger notes that the natural process of predation exhibits admirable and aesthetically stimulating traits in both predators and prey. The muscle, power, intelligence, and sometimes cooperative behavior of the predator, and the alertness and fleet-footedness of the prey. As these examples show, functionalist accounts tend to focus on animals in the wild. Now, I'm going to focus on a version of functionalism that Glenn Parsons and Alan Carlson have called the internal conception of the functional beauty. On this, the function of a thing is internal to or part of its beauty, in contrast to an external conception, one which where an object's beauty would fit in and contribute to its function, but it's not an internal element. So Parsons, in another paper, expresses an internal conception this way. He says it is not merely that the shape of the cheetah's body is attractive and also happens to be functional by allowing it to reach great speeds. Rather, the shape of its body is attractive in part because it is functional. They also require understanding of how an animal fulfills its function, not merely knowledge of what the function is. So a functional account of the beauty of a particular animal is therefore dependent on the type of animal it is and its role in its environment. And so in order to appreciate its beauty, we've got to know something about it. As science is our best source of knowledge of nature, some degree of scientific knowledge is a necessary condition for proper aesthetic appreciation. Minimally, we must know that what we are appreciating is not an artifact, but natural. So we mustn't treat nature as if it's art. Generally, more is required than that. On a weaker conception, we need to be able to classify an animal as prey or predator, as mammal or reptile. Stronger accounts demand more knowledge of the animal's ecological niche and the information conveyed by more precise classification. And our categorizations must be correct, for they affect our aesthetic judgments. A creature that is graceful and exuberant, seen as a whale, might be lumbering and clumsy if wrongly categorized as a fish. And Carlson concludes from this that appropriate aesthetic appreciation depends upon correct classification. And later with Parsons, he says that our understanding of how a correctly categorized animal carries out its function alters our visual experience of it. Note that this does meet that constraint that I mentioned earlier, that appropriate aesthetic appreciation must reveal the aesthetic properties of the object. Carlson says, scientific knowledge is essential for appropriate aesthetic appreciation of nature. Without it, we do not know how to appreciate it appropriately and are likely to miss its aesthetic qualities and value. Thus, if this account is correct, it explains the ability of science to both promote and enhance aesthetic appreciation of the natural world. So knowledge of non-aesthetic properties, the kind of animal it is, what its role is, how it functions, and so on, is necessary for proper appreciation of aesthetic properties, and it reveals those aesthetic properties. And scientific knowledge therefore provides the criteria for us assessing our aesthetic judgments as more or less appropriate. It is a cognitively rich account of aesthetic appreciation. Now, functionalism had some obvious attractions. First, at least prima facie, it seems to make sense of much viewing of animals in the wild. As most people have some rough sense of the basic kind of animal they're looking at, a weak version of functionalism is not demanding and it sounds plausible. We admire the springbuck's speed and endurance as displayed in its lean and streamlined body, knowing that those properties allow it to escape the lion. And we admire the lion's power and ferocity, even if it's expressing its killing potential. We recognize that the subtle coloring of the impala allows it to blend into its environment. And if we know a bit more, we might see them as instances of a particular species, a healthy or unhealthy instance, a young or a mature instance. And then we might be able to make more fine-grained judgments about their fitness for their particular role in the ecosystem. So a stronger version of functionalism would recommend this further categorization and the deeper appreciation that it brings along. So notice that this implies that any flourishing fit animal can be experienced as beautiful. A crocodile, a warthog, a lanky giraffe, and even a blobfish are as beautiful as the leopard when seen in the correct categories. And this result in different versions is often embraced as positive aesthetics, and it's thought to be unique to natural objects and nature as a whole. What I want to do is show you a quick picture of the blobfish, just to get your intuitions on this, because they really are quite remarkable. So that is a blobfish. It apparently really looks like this, which is a bit like a squashed potato. But according to positive aesthetics people, if you know enough about the blobfish, what it's doing, how it does it, where it is, you can, and if it's a healthy instance of its kind, you can't but see that as beautiful in some way. I'm not sure what I think about the blobfish. The second advantage of functionalist accounts is it makes sense of the truism that knowledgeable and experienced people see much more than the rest of us. And you can recall those non-ethical examples that I mentioned earlier. Because vision is always structured by our individual psychological states and personal, cultural, historical assumptions, the vision of people who are more knowledgeable, more enthusiastic and curious will be more searching, detailed or wider ranging as required. And they'll be informed by beliefs and values that then support and encourage those views. They will literally see the whale or the owl, where the rest of us will only see ocean spray or a tangle of branches. And from there on, they can discriminate aesthetic qualities that we will probably miss. And the third advantage is that it allows us to understand how our actual looking at animals may be more or less aesthetically appropriate. It will depend upon whether our categorization of the animals is correct. But despite these advantages of functionalism, I want to raise three related problems with it as a way of looking at animals in particular. I'll raise two of them just very quickly and then probably focus more on the third. The first problem is that it's just not clear which categories should inform our vision of animals. Animals and pretty much everything in the world can be put under various categories. They can be more general, they can be more specific, there can be different kinds of categories. Should I see the blobfish as vermin, as fish, as a sentient life form, as an instantiation of species X, as a vital life form, as a funny blob? And all of those seem like they could be plausible and correct in themselves. It's also not clear which of those categories can inform my view of the aesthetic properties of the creature. So should the fact that it is vermin inform the way I actually see and experientially see that creature? And obviously a deeper issue here is whether it makes sense to argue over which categories reveal aesthetic properties that are really there. I'm going to leave that problem there, though I'll suggest later that it does matter ethically. The second problem with these accounts is what Carlson and Parsons call the problem of translation. And this is that it is at least debatable whether fitness is an aesthetic property in the way required. So according to functionalism, if we are perceptually aware of the function of an object, it must alter the way that we perceive the object and the aesthetic properties that we notice. But despite that truism that knowledgeable people see more, how exactly can attention to function alter or influence aesthetic judgment? Parsons and Carlson spell this out. And again, I'm quoting from them. The claim that something is functionally beautiful must mean that the function of the object is somehow present in or translates into the look or sound of the object. For when things are functionally beautiful, it is not that we see beauty and then assess how well that beauty fits with function. Rather, knowing the function is what allows observers to see the beauty in the first place. So somehow knowing the function of the object must change the way the object looks to us. But how exactly that can happen is unclear. Parsons and Carlson need an account of how we can have a pleasurable perceptual experience of fitness for its own sake. Some people might suggest that the pleasure we take in something's fitness for function may not be a pleasure in the object for itself at all, but in its ability to fulfill some need. And on many inferential accounts, that kind of pleasure is not aesthetic pleasure at all. Or we may simply insist that we are admiring the sleekness, elegance, strength, or brilliant colors of an animal purely formally. Their main defense of their position in the case of animals is negative. They argue that we can see that defects in a creature make it ugly because it is then manifestly incapable of performing its function. And then they suggest that when a creature is functionally fit, we'll see it as beautiful. They write, the aesthetic displeasure that we take in a diseased, malformed, or damaged organism is displeasure in its apparent dysfunctionality, its looking unfit. What is displeasing aesthetically about such creatures is precisely that their parts and limbs appear manifestly incapable of doing what they are supposed to do. And they insist that we're not displeased simply by the formal shape of, say, a broken wing or a worn down tusk, since that same shape may be aesthetically pleasing in other animals. It is the fact that this creature's wing or tusk is broken and therefore cannot perform its function in this kind of creature that makes it ugly. Now, I'm still unsure of what to make of that defense, and I'm also not quite sure what would settle the issue here. I certainly do admire the cheetah's sleekness and stealth, the elephant's calm and weighty solidity, the elegant stripes of the zebra, and my admiration seems aesthetic. I may know that they are functional properties, but I'm not sure I'm seeing or appreciating those aesthetic qualities under that heading, even if I'm doing so unawares. My seeing the zebras or giraffes' markings as elegant and fun at the same time does not seem to require that I first categorize them and know something about camouflage and how they survive in the veldt. If I do know those facts, I have extra knowledge certainly, but how would that then change my aesthetic appreciation of the stripes rather than my cognitive appreciation of it? When I see a visibly injured or old zebra, my judgment is not, I think, that it is ugly or less beautiful in virtue of defects. My judgment is that it is injured and looks injured, and the injuries might detract from its beauty, but it seems to me that that is a separate perception or a separate judgment. So I'm going to leave that uncertain, because in either case, I think these considerations I've just mentioned point to a deeper shortcoming of functionalist approaches and the kind of looking that they would advocate as appropriate looking. And these problems seem to come out even in the case of wild animals where functionalism does seem more appropriate. So this leads me to my third worry and the second question that I noted right at the start. The worry is that the functionalist way of looking at animals is aesthetically constrained by its commitments, and in virtue of that is ethically lacking. I don't argue that functionalism should be entirely rejected here. I'm more interested to show that it can't be the whole story about animal beauty, and that in some cases it is both aesthetically and ethically inappropriate. And again, I want to make 3 points here. The first is that functionalism makes it difficult to perceive animals as individuals because they ignore or underplay another aesthetic property, appreciation of which is crucial to properly seeing them, and I call this property animation. The second is that paying attention to the faces of animals reinforces this first case. And the third is that appropriate attention to animation is non-accidentally related to certain ethical attitudes towards animals. And so I look at each of these in turn. The kind of looking that would be guided by a functionalist framework is essentially general and exemplary. It allows us to admire individual animals, but essentially as instances of a kind. We're not looking for individuality or personality or distinction from others in ways that are not captured by the language of token and types. The separate non-exemplary existence of each animal, its subjectivity and its physical instantiation in a particular body seems aesthetically irrelevant at best, or for functionalists sentimental or anthropomorphic at worst. It's therefore not surprising that functionalism is associated with environmental movements that are concerned most with the preservation of species and habitats, that see individuals as instances of kinds, the ethical significance of which is more fundamental and crucial than the individual animal. And it's also not surprising then that some functionalists are attracted to positive aesthetics. If we correctly perceive and understand nature in the categories given by science, we cannot fail to judge all of nature as beautiful. The descriptions that some of the functionalists I've mentioned give show that they recognize that much of the beauty we admire inheres in animals' grace and economy of movement. They are not inert bodies. And Tom Greaves argues that perceiving animal movement underlies all our other aesthetic responses. I'm quoting from him here. The lived movement is what is aesthetically appreciated, moving from subtle shifts to awkward wariness to utterly absorbed speed. Through their open and indeterminate movement, animals express what he calls wildness, the very being of animals. Even in an animal's repose, he says, we anticipate movement. Stillness and movement are not separable moments of animal lives. And he suggests further, but quite briefly, that we think of the mental states of animals as embodied in their movements. He doesn't develop this point, but I'm going to pick up on it again later. If I had time, it would be interesting to look into Hegel and Ruskin, who seem to be ancestors of this kind of view that we see in Greaves. The language of vitality and health is very central to both of them, though they come to very different conclusions about animal beauty. So central to our perception of many animals then, if I'm correct here, is the appearance of each being a living, moving, vital creature. Even when they are at rest, this vitality is latent. And importantly, we have the sense of them from our perceptions of their embodiedness. Our vision is of corporeality, but it is not inert matter, the inanimate objects that we see and find beautiful. Body and flesh are, in these older terms, vital. And I want to consider this now in more depth by looking further at the aesthetic property that I call animation. So our aesthetic experience of many animals is an experience of animate, particular, vivid life, contained in but emanating from the boundaries given by the body. It is a perception of bodily subjectivity. We perceive corporeality vivified and infused with subjectivity. The expression of an individual center of experience, expressed through a particular style and economy of movement and bearing and responsiveness to the environment. Now, this is the complex aesthetic property that I call animation, and it is part of our sense, our intuitive sense, that animals are centers of experience, however non-self-reflective that experience might be. Our perceptual experience of animation, partly given by experience of their bodily existence, is what allows us to see animals as individuals and not just types fulfilling predetermined functions, and so to see where I think functional counts are lacking. Now, by animation, I don't mean speed or busyness or liveliness, which Hegel means by vital. I think sloths and maybe tortoises are animate if our perceptual experience of them is of independent centers of existence with their own perceptions on the world. Now, a lot of people, Hegel included, are going to deny that animals have this aesthetic property of animation. They would think that I'd be inferring it from experiences of other aesthetic and non-aesthetic features. But I think that unless we are already looking at animals through a particular lens of beliefs about their significant differences to humans, it is difficult not to see, literally see, their bodies as expressing subjectivity. Here is a place where background beliefs and values really do influence what we see, and then what we see is taken as support for those beliefs. Denying that we see animation in animals would be, I think, as obtuse as denying that we see it in other people. We don't experience people as instances and mechanical bodies, although what we see of them is their bodies, what Hegel calls the outer crust. The appropriate aesthetic experience must be guided by the nature of the object. And so I think it is only those in the grip of a theory that would deny that animals are conscious, have perspectives, and then further deny that this is something we can perceive when we perceive them as a whole. Now, interestingly, there's some details in Parson and Carlson's account of perceiving fitness that seem in fact to support my point about animation, and so lessen the distance between their functionalist account and the account I've just offered here. So, as we've seen, their functionalism requires scientific knowledge of the nature of the object, but then they say this as well. To appreciate the functional beauty of an organism requires approaching that organism as a creature of plans, priorities, and projects, insofar as it involves considering the function of animal traits and parts. This is because the function of those traits and parts are bound up with the plans, priorities, and projects that animals possess. And they give this as an example. The fitness of the cheetah, manifested perceptually to us, shows us its plans and priorities. For instance, remaining camouflaged, quickly running down large prey at high speeds, sighting other animals at long distance. So what they think is that when we're appreciating functional beauty, we are appreciating the organism as a creature that makes plans, has projects. And I just find this a bit odd. So far, and this is a not important point, but so far none of the descriptions they offer of animals have included such mental states or apparent agency, and the sudden appearance of them at this point is surprising. Nonetheless, I want to say either that their account here is tacitly assuming something like animation, and so is no longer strictly functional, or as functional, the view just doesn't seem true. I don't see that appreciating function per se properly does require approaching the organism as something with plans and priorities. I know that the function of a cheetah's small flat head is that it streamlines the body and positions the eyes high up to allow for a wide field of vision. The black tear stripes running down from the eyes to the mouth apparently might function like a rifle scope that focuses the cheetah's sight. And I can give admittedly clumsy descriptions in mechanical terms and avoid conferring subjectivity without having a poor review of function, it seems to me. Of course, I've argued that if we do attend to the physicality of animals, we will see their animation, but I don't see that this is required for functionalism per se. My worries with functionalism then are reinforced by returning to the psychology of vision and what we know about human beings. What we know is that from infancy, humans recognize and seek out faces, and they are able to interpret them in astonishingly subtle ways. So Elkin says that the face is the object I see best. It is the sight of the most nuanced looking of which I am capable. We search out faces, and our immediate response is to something intentional, with marks and movements open to interpretation by a viewer who shares a psychology with the bearer of that face. Even newborns offer themselves to us for interpretation, and we immediately use the rich psychological terms to describe their behavior that we do for adults. Elkin writes that when we believe we are receiving expressions from a face, we are imagining a single whole mind behind the face. To read a face, to get a message from it, to see it as a face, we need to posit that it exists with the whole mind. As some vegetarians put it, to kill something and then to eat it, if it has a face, can be deeply unsettling. And the more that animals resemble us facially, the more our sympathies can be called upon. Emily Brady notes that our aesthetic appreciation of animals is often tied to an appreciation of their expressive qualities. So we say that the lion is majestic, or the bird's calls are melancholic or cheerful. And she argues that in the case of many animals, especially but not necessarily those resembling humans, it is their rich expressiveness that is aesthetically relevant and potent. She writes, imagine animals without their expressions, facial or otherwise, and then try imagining humans in the same way. I have argued that animation is apparent in the movement and behavior of animals, but another obvious way we experience it is by looking at their faces. And of the face, the eyes are paramount, the vehicle for vision and often the object of vision. When I catch the eye of another creature, human or non-human, I see another creature seeing me, seeing it. And yet it's important that when we see another creature's face or look into its eyes, their bodies too take on a particular aspect. I would find it difficult to consider as a mere insensate object, a creature into whose eyes I have gazed and which have gazed back. Again, looking at the face and into the eyes emphasizes that they are not just inert flesh. The discussion so far suggests that if we can attend to the face of an animal, we will naturally respond to it as minded. Animation, as I conceive it, is a condition of this, a more fundamental aesthetic quality that underlies expressive properties and that perception of embodied minds that Greaves mentions. Whereas Brady concentrates on expressive, emotional, and symbolic qualities, my account focuses at a more fundamental level on the expression of a subjective center of awareness. And these accounts are compatible, and Brady at one point suggests a view that is similar to mine. My view, however, is less restrictive than Brady's because animation is not necessarily tied to expressiveness. In the experience of emotional expressiveness, we might think depends on the prior experience of individuality. In support of this, we might ask, and I'll just raise this in passing, whether we see faces as fit for function. In one sense, I suppose that we can. I suppose surgeons who are reconstructing a face after an accident have to consider whether the different parts of the face will be able to do what they have to do after the operation. But that doesn't strike me as an aesthetic experience. And if we take faces to be essentially minded in our perception of them, it wouldn't be to see a face at all. Bodies are easier to assess for fitness, of course, than our faces. And this is one reason that functionalist accounts fit better with our experiences of bodies. Now, I've spoken for quite a while, and I want to conclude with my third point and draw out quickly the internal relation between aesthetics. Although much of what I will say is probably obvious already from the preceding discussions. Face-to-face encounters are central to some ethical traditions, though these tend to concentrate on human encounters, with Jacques Derrida being an important exception. So we all know Levinas's famous emphasis on the face, for instance. So given our human tendency to focus on faces, to find them minded, and to respond to them with concern, we could expect a similar range of responses to human and animal faces, if attended to closely. Most animals have faces, and faces humanize, as cartoonists and animators know. Ethics enters here, as seeing faces as significantly like us tends to make it harder to treat the creature harmfully or disrespectfully. It also makes it harder to view animals through a functionalist lens, which generalizes and blurs difference. Now, my point here is not that seeing faces is a necessary condition for seeing bodies as animated. Bodies are quite obviously animated, as I've already said, without glimpsing faces. Nor is my point that seeing faces and perceiving animation will necessarily have ethical resonance for us. And if we read Hunter's accounts of the hunt, it shows this clearly. I'm making the weaker claim that seeing faces is one reliable but defeasible way of recognizing animation. Given that we most fundamentally understand face in human terms and with human exemplars from birth, and given that when we see animal faces, we see them as meaningfully like us in being expressive minds, we are more likely to feel concern for animals with faces, more likely but not inevitably. The more general point, however, applies just as much to our view of bodies. that internal to the notion of animation are ethical constraints and attitudes, ones that recognize animals as separate centers of experience, just as we recognize other human beings to be. And from that point, as many normative theories have shown, duties and obligations to animals seem to follow. Now, this is by far a complete account of looking at animals. It probably overstates at some points the importance of faces looking like ours, and that does tend to run the danger of anthropomorphism again. But I hope that the exploration has shown how we could take vision to be literally significant to ethics, how better vision could also be better attitudes, characters, and actions. And I've argued that functionalist accounts do not adequately capture better ways of seeing animals, and that they lead to ethically reductive attitudes towards them. Instead, appropriate looking reveals the aesthetic property of animation, and internal to animation is a recognition of a separate center of awareness. The starting point then of appreciating animal beauty, which is difficult to deny, might then lead us to ethics from a slightly different direction. And I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you.